The galaxy, in its infinite and occasionally questionable wisdom, had decided that Cathara 7 was a Class 2 wilderness world. This meant, according to the exhaustive and generally reliable Interstellar Survey Corps, that the planet possessed minimal aggressive fauna, moderate vegetation density, and atmospheric conditions suitable for 73% of known spacefaring species. The classification suggested a world where one might conduct resource assessments while enjoying the occasional pleasant walk through alien meadows, perhaps spotting colorful local wildlife from a safe distance while sipping something warm and mildly caffeinated. The 12-member expedition that landed in the northern continent's river valley had every reason to trust this assessment. The Vexthari military coordinator, a 7-foot-tall being named Torvin, whose exoskeleton gleamed with decorative combat citations, had declared the mission barely worth deploying armor protocols for. The Quilnari xenobiologist Plix had brought scanning equipment designed for cataloging insects and small reptilian equivalents. Even the Mordane pilot, Hekar, whose species was known for pathological paranoia about atmospheric landings, had set up his sleeping pod a full 50 meters from the ship rather than inside it. The human, a wiry specimen named Garrett Moss, who wore his hair in a perpetually disheveled state and possessed the kind of unremarkable face that made him forgettable in group photos, had simply nodded at the briefing and asked where they kept the camping shovels. Nobody paid much attention to this question. Humans were like that, always asking about tools that seemed 3 technological ages behind everyone else's equipment, then somehow finding uses for them that made perfect sense only after the fact. The first day passed exactly as predicted. Samples were collected. The Quilnari made excited chirping sounds at fungal specimens. The Dreymoth engineers, a pair of crystalline beings named Zeth and Yora, identified 17 potential mineral deposits worth commercial consideration. Garrett spent most of the afternoon walking the perimeter of their camp, occasionally crouching to examine the ground, and once spending 20 minutes studying a tree that had claw marks scraped into its bark at roughly 8 feet high. Bit tall for the local fauna on record, he mentioned to Plix during the evening meal. The Quilnari barely glanced up from his data tablet, antenna waving dismissively. Old Mark's weathered patterns suggest at least 3 seasonal cycles, likely an extinct species or migratory pattern we have not yet documented. Nothing currently active exhibits such dimensions. Garrett made a non-committal sound and returned to his food, though his eyes kept drifting toward the darkening tree line with an expression that might have been mistaken for idle curiosity by anyone who had not spent significant time with humans. Those who had might have recognized it as something else entirely, the look of a predator trying to calculate the behavior of something it did not yet fully understand. Night fell on Cathara 7 with the kind of absolute darkness that only planets without moons could provide. The camp's perimeter lights created a bubble of civilization surrounded by an ocean of black, and for the first 3 hours, nothing disturbed the peaceful sounds of nocturnal insects and the occasional rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth. Then came the howl. It started low, a resonant sound that vibrated through the ground before climbing into registers that made several species present clasp their auditory organs in pain. It was answered by another howl to the east, then south, then west. Within 30 seconds the expedition realized they were surrounded by something that was coordinating, communicating, and had waited until full darkness to announce its presence. Perimeter scanners. Torvin barked, his military training overriding his initial shock. Get me visual confirmation and species classification. The scanners, which had cost more than most planetary settlements' annual budgets, lit up with contacts. 12 signatures. No, 15. No, 23. The numbers kept climbing as thermal imaging revealed shapes moving through the forest with disturbing speed and coordination, circling the camp in patterns that suggested intelligence well above what one expected from simple predators. The first one that entered the light made 3 of the expedition members immediately activate their emergency beacon bracelets, the kind designed to summon rescue shuttles from orbit for life-threatening situations. It stood roughly 10 feet at the shoulder, built like someone had taken a bear, a tiger, and something that belonged in deep water, then added too many joints to the legs, and an unsettling number of eyes that reflected the camp lights with a crystalline intelligence. Its hide seemed to shift colors, not quite camouflage, but something that made tracking its exact position difficult even in direct light. The mouth, when it opened in what might have been a threat display or possibly a grin, revealed 3 rows of teeth arranged in a pattern that suggested it could bite in multiple directions simultaneously. "That is not Class 2 fauna," Plix whispered, which might have won an award for the most obvious statement in galactic exploration history. The beast took 1 step closer, then another. It was testing them, and everyone present knew it. Torvin raised his plasma carbine, a weapon that could punch holes through armored vehicles, and fired a warning shot that superheated the air between his position and the creature. The sound should have sent any animal fleeing. The beast tilted its head, seemed to consider the display, then made a coughing sound that its 17 friends around the perimeter echoed in a way that suggested they found the whole thing amusing. Then they rushed the camp from 4 directions simultaneously. What followed was chaos filtered through the lens of species that had mostly evolved beyond the immediate threat of being eaten. The Vexthari had protocols, excellent protocols developed over millennia of military engagement, none of which covered giant coordinated pack hunters that your weapons barely slow down. Plasma fire lit up the night. Force shields flickered into existence. The Mordane pilot activated hover mode on the shuttle, creating a downdraft that sent equipment flying and accomplished nothing except annoying everyone who was not actively being chased by something with too many teeth. The beasts worked together with frightening efficiency. One would charge, forcing defenders to fire and adjust positions. While attention focused there, 2 more would probe from different angles. They tested shields, weapons range, response time. They were not simply attacking, they were learning. Garrett, who had grabbed a metal support strut from a supply crate when the howling started, stood near the center of camp and watched, just watched. His eyes tracked movement patterns, measured distances, noted which directions the beasts favored and which they avoided. When one came within range, he struck it across the snout with the strut, not a sophisticated blow, just a solid hit that leveraged momentum and aimed for sensitive areas. The beast recoiled more from surprise than pain and retreated to reassess this particular human, who had the audacity to hit back with something primitive. Dawn came with the kind of grudging slowness that made everyone question whether Kethera 7 had somehow extended its rotational period out of spite. The beasts withdrew as the first light touched the horizon, melting back into the forest with coordinated precision that made their retreat feel more like a tactical repositioning than a defeat. The expedition took stock. 3 people injured, none fatally, but enough to require medical attention that their portable equipment could barely provide. Equipment scattered or damaged. Morale somewhere beneath the planet's bedrock, and the growing realization that they were stuck here for 6 more days until the scheduled pickup, because apparently someone at mission planning had decided emergency extraction protocols were unnecessarily expensive for Class 2 worlds. Torvin immediately called for a strategy meeting, which meant everyone stood around looking at holographic displays while proposing solutions that sounded impressive, but ignored the fundamental problem of having insufficient resources to implement any of them. We establish a hard light perimeter, Torvin proposed, gesturing at projections. Create a full dome barrier that prevents physical penetration. That would drain our power cells in 4 hours, Hikar pointed out, his tentacles twitching with anxiety. Then we have no shields, no weapons, no camp lighting, and no way to call for help when the beasts return in the dark. I can design a sonic deterrent system, Plix offered, antenna waving with scientific enthusiasm despite the circumstances. Frequencies that disrupt their neural patterns, create a zone of biological rejection. Testing, calibration and construction would take 3 days minimum. Zeth interrupted, her crystalline form refracting light in patterns that suggested skepticism. Assuming the frequencies actually affect their physiology, assuming they do not simply adapt. Garrett, who had been examining the claw marks on equipment cases, spoke up with the kind of casual tone that suggested he was commenting on weather rather than survival strategy. How high can they jump? Everyone turned to look at him. The beasts, he clarified, though his attention remained on the scratches. Anyone clock their vertical leap capacity, approximately 7 feet from standing position, Plix replied after consulting his scanner logs. Why does this matter? And they avoided the area near the supply crates even when they had clear approach vectors. Also avoided the section where the ground slopes toward the river drainage. Garrett straightened up, brushing dirt off his hands. They are heavy, built for power, not agility. Bad footing makes them cautious. So, Torvin's exoskeleton clicked with impatience. So they hunt like earth wolves, coordination, endurance, wearing down prey through sustained pressure. But they have the individual mass of grizzly bears. That combination means specific vulnerabilities. Garrett looked around the camp with an expression that might have been thoughtful or possibly calculating. They can be trapped. The silence that followed was not the respectful kind. Trapped, Plix repeated, his translator somehow managing to convey the verbal equivalent of eye-rolling despite Quilnari lacking eyes as most species understood them. You propose we defend against coordinated pack hunters using what exactly? Primitive snares. Perhaps we should also try hitting them with rocks. I did hit one with metal, Garrett pointed out. Worked pretty well. Hikar made a sound like escaping steam. This is not a primitive world where you can simply dig holes and cover them with leaves. These are intelligent predators on unfamiliar terrain. We need sophisticated solutions. Sophisticated solutions require resources we do not have. Garrett interrupted, his voice remaining level despite the dismissal. But I can work with dirt, wood and the basic physics of things falling into holes. Give me 6 hours, and whatever equipment nobody else is using. Torvin looked ready to argue, then seemed to calculate the effort required versus the minimal resources Garrett was requesting. Fine, do whatever humans do when they play in the dirt. The rest of us will work on actual defensive measures. Garrett nodded, grabbed a shovel from the equipment stores, and walked toward the perimeter with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he had already spent several hours planning in his head and was now merely executing a pre-existing design. By midday, while the others were constructing a power distribution network that might sustain partial shielding for 6 hours, if nobody breathed too heavily near the generators, Garrett had dug 4 pits at strategic points around the camp perimeter. Each was roughly 6 feet deep and 8 feet across, dimensions that seemed arbitrary until one noticed they were positioned at the exact approaches the beasts had favored during the night attack. He covered the pits with a lattice of local branches, not to deceive, because the beasts would likely detect that, but to create a visual obstacle that would slow their approach and make them choose alternate routes. Those alternate routes led to areas where he had used climbing rope from the supply stores to create trip lines at shin height for creatures built like the beasts. Behind the trip lines, he positioned equipment crates at angles that would funnel movement toward either the pits or the sections of ground he had deliberately loosened and destabilized. Yora, watching from a distance while calibrating mineral sensors, found herself fascinated despite her initial skepticism. "Why the loose ground sections? Weight distribution," Garrett replied, not looking up from his work. "They are heavy, and they move fast. Unstable ground forces them to slow down and pick their steps. Slow predators lose their advantage. This seems laboriously manual." "Yeah." Garrett grinned without humor. "That is kind of humanity's whole thing. We are not strong or fast or heavily armored. We are just relentlessly annoying about not dying." The second night arrived with the same oppressive darkness, but this time the camp was slightly more prepared. Weapons were positioned at optimal coverage points. Power cells were fresh. Medical supplies were staged, and around the perimeter, a human had spent the day creating obstacles that looked more like an archaeological site than a defensive position. The howls started earlier this time. The beasts had learned that waiting accomplished nothing, so they simply announced their presence and moved in. The first beast to hit one of Garrett's pit traps weighed approximately 800 pounds and had been moving at 30 miles per hour when the ground beneath it suddenly was not there anymore. The sound it made falling, a surprised yelp that cut off in an undignified thump, caused the entire pack to freeze and reassess. The second beast, circling to investigate, triggered a tripline that sent it sprawling directly into Torvin's optimal firing range. The Vextari did not waste the opportunity. 3 plasma shots later, the pack was down one member and learning that the strange modifications to the terrain were not decorative. What followed was less a battle and more a tactical chess match between a pack intelligence used to overwhelming prey through coordination and a single human who had spent most of human history figuring out how to kill things larger and more dangerous than himself, using nothing but spite and engineering. Beasts approached from the east and found ground that collapsed under their weight. They shifted north and ran into barriers that forced them into lanes where the expedition's weapons fire was most effective. They tried rushing from multiple directions simultaneously and discovered that pit traps work regardless of how many of your friends are also running toward the same hole. Garrett stood near the center of the camp, holding his metal strut and watching the patterns. He called adjustments to the others, not commands, just observations. 3 coming from your 10 o'clock, Torvin. They will hit the unstable ground in 6 seconds and slow down. Wait for it. Or Hikar, 1 circling to your position. It will avoid the pit but has to jump the tripline. Shoot where it will land, not where it is. Around midnight, the Alpha finally made its appearance, a beast half again as large as the others, with hide that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It had been watching from the tree line, letting the pack probe defenses while it assessed. Now it made its move, rushing the camp from the west at a speed that seemed physically impossible for something that massive. It cleared the first pit trap, dodged the tripline with shocking agility, shouldered through a barrier that should have stopped it, and came face to face with Garrett, who had positioned himself in exactly the spot the Alpha's momentum would carry it to. The human looked up at the beast that towered over him. The beast looked down at the human, who had turned its hunting ground into an obstacle course. For a moment, neither moved. Then Garrett smiled, stepped backward, and the Alpha's next step landed on a pressure plate connected to a net made from cargo rigging that snapped upward from both sides, entangling the creature in synthetic fibers designed to secure spacecraft cargo through gravitational fluctuations. The Alpha thrashed, snarled, and tried to break free, while discovering that humans had been tying things down for a very long time and had gotten quite good at it. The pack, seeing their leader captured and suspended 3 feet off the ground in an undignified tangle of netting, made what might have been the wisest decision of their evolutionary history. They retreated into the forest, their howls fading to confused whimpers in the distance. Dawn broke over HFY-7 to reveal a camp that looked like it had been struck by a localized tornado that coincidentally only affected the perimeter. And near one of the earlier pit traps, Garrett Moss was butchering one of the smaller beasts that had broken its neck in the fall, working with a utility knife and the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this was not his first time converting a predator into portions. Plix approached slowly, his scientific curiosity warring with something that might have been horror. "What are you doing?" "Cooking breakfast." Garrett gestured to a fire he had started using local wood and a plasma lighter. "We have been eating protein rations for 3 days. This thing probably tastes terrible, but at least it will be fresh terrible. You are eating the creatures that tried to eat us." "Yeah, that is generally how it works." Garrett skewered a chunk of meat on a metal rod and held it over the flames. "On Earth we have a saying, do not be food. I am just making sure everyone understands which category we fall into." Torvin joined them, his exoskeleton still showing scorch marks from the night's combat. He looked at the human cooking predator meat over an open fire while the captured alpha snarled from its net prison nearby, and seemed to reach a conclusion that his military training had not prepared him for. "You turned them from hunters into provisions, well, also research subjects." Garrett flipped the meat. "The alpha is still alive because Plix probably wants biological data. The ones in the pits can be studied, and the ones the pack carried away will teach the rest to stay away from this area." Multi-purpose solution. The Quilnari, despite himself, pulled out a scanner and began taking readings from the captured alpha. The readings were fascinating: neural structures suggesting pack-mind communication, metabolic processes optimized for sustained pursuit, muscle density that explained their terrifying speed. All of it was data that would revolutionize xenobiology's understanding of predator evolution on high-gravity worlds. But what he kept circling back to was the simple fact that none of these sophisticated biological advantages had mattered when confronted with holes in the ground, ropes tied correctly, and a human who understood that millions of years of evolution could be defeated by making the environment suck enough for the evolved creature. Yora, who had been silent since witnessing the previous night's events, finally spoke. "Your species does this regularly. Confronts predators this way." Garrett shrugged, testing the meat's doneness with the kind of attention chefs throughout the galaxy would recognize. Humanity spent most of its existence being the thing that refused to give up. We are not the strongest or the fastest, but we are patient, persistent, and we keep mental notes about what works and what does not. He pulled the meat from the fire and examined it critically. "Also, we eat basically anything, which some species find disturbing, but which makes us highly adaptable." The remaining 4 days of the expedition passed without incident. The Beast Pack, now missing several members, and having watched their alpha get caught in what amounted to a very effective bag, decided the area was haunted by demons and relocated to hunting grounds where the prey did not play dirty. The expedition completed their surveys, collected their samples, and prepared for extraction. Plix spent most of the remaining time studying the captured specimens and writing papers in his head about pack dynamics and environmental adaptation strategies. The alpha, once sedated and properly scanned, was released at a distance from the camp with a tracking beacon attached. It would provide years of research data and probably some extremely confusing stories for the next pack it joined. Torvin found himself redesigning military field protocols based on something he was calling environmental pressure warfare, and trying to figure out how to explain to his superiors that sometimes digging holes was more effective than plasma cannons. Heka simply updated his species survival database with a new entry that roughly translated to "if trapped on hostile world with limited resources, bring a human." They are disturbingly good at this. When the extraction shuttle arrived on schedule, the pilot, a Dramoth named Von, who had done 17 routine pickups this rotation, barely glanced at the expedition manifest before launching into his standard speech about cargo securing and atmospheric departure protocols. Then he noticed the camp setup. The perimeter that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed in warfare via landscape modification. The collection of predator specimens in stasis containers, and Garrett Moss, sitting by a fire cooking meat while wearing the kind of relaxed expression that suggested he had just spent a pleasant week camping rather than defending against nightly attacks from apex predators. "Class 2 world," Von said slowly, his crystalline form refracting confusion into visible light patterns. The file said Class 2. File was wrong, Torvin replied, loading equipment with the kind of deliberate calm that came from having one's entire tactical worldview restructured. Turns out it is more like Class 5, possibly Class 6, depending on whose classification system you use. And you all survived. The human-built traps, Plix added, as if this explained everything. Which, in retrospect, it actually did. Von looked at Garrett, who waved casually while turning meat over the flames. The pilot made a note in his log about updating the planetary classification and adding a recommendation that future expeditions to Cathera 7 include at least one human in the roster, preferably one who knew what a shovel was used for. The expedition departed Cathera 7 at noon, leaving behind a camp that would eventually be reclaimed by forest, pit traps that would confuse archaeologists centuries later, and a beast pack that had learned a valuable lesson about assumptions. Back in orbit, while the others filed reports and medical assessments, Garrett looked out the observation port at the planet below. Plix joined him after several minutes of silence. "Your species evolved surrounded by predators," the Quilnari observed. "It was not a question. Pretty much everything wanted to eat us at various points," Garrett confirmed. "So we got creative. Outlasted them. Humans are not impressive in a straight fight, but we are absolutely excellent at changing the parameters until it is not a straight fight anymore. And you see this as an advantage. I see it as reality." Garrett glanced at the scientist. "The galaxy has species that are stronger, faster, smarter in some ways. But I have yet to meet one that matches humans for sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept the role of prey." He smiled, and there was something in that expression that made Plix understand why the beasts had ultimately decided to hunt elsewhere. "We have been the thing that other things run from for a long time. We are just polite enough not to advertise it." The ship jumped to faster-than-light travel, carrying its crew back to civilization, where reports would be filed, classifications would be updated, and scholars would write papers about the incident. Some would focus on the biological data, others would analyze the tactical adaptations. A few would examine the philosophical implications of primitive techniques defeating sophisticated threats. But the detail that would spread through stations and ships, the story that would be retold in a dozen languages across 100 worlds, was simpler and somehow more unsettling. On Cathera 7, when the predators came and everyone else prepared to run or hide or die, the humans stayed, built traps, and at dawn, while others recovered from the night's terror, cooked breakfast from the things that had tried to eat them. The galaxy, in its infinite and occasionally humbling wisdom, adjusted its understanding of humanity slightly. They were not just the species that asked about shovels at briefings. They were the species that understood something fundamental about survival, that even the most advanced civilizations had forgotten, that intelligence was not about having the best technology or the strongest weapons. It was about looking at something that wanted to kill you, figuring out how it thought, and then making the ground beneath it stop being solid at exactly the wrong moment. Somewhere on Kethera 7, in a forest valley that now smelled permanently of human-set fires, a beast pack howled at the moons that were not there. But the sound carried a different tone now, less a hunting call, more a warning to other things that walked the dark. The warning was simple, if one translated the meaning rather than the sound: be cautious of the small ones who carry shovels. They dig graves before the fight even starts, and they are very, very patient about who falls in them.